ॐ ऐं ह्रीं श्रीं अमृतद्रव्यविधये नमः। ॐ ऐं ह्रीं श्रीं रम्भदीपाय नमः। ॐ ऐं ह्रीं श्रीं ननविघ्नोपमध्यानाय।
I would like to welcome you to the second episode of the Heritage series of VidCast by Imagine Heritage not-profit organization. I am Spyridon Kogkas, co-founder of Imagine Heritage and the lead editor of Thrasma Journal and Publications. And today for our VidCast, we have the honor to host a beautiful discussion. Welcome, Mr.Avikunthak. And
Thank you for having.
again, I want to share with you how proud I'm feeling at the moment to have this opportunity to discuss together. Allow me first of all, to share with our friends and partners internationally a few words about your work, actually. Mr. Avikunthak is an Indian avant-garde filmmaker, film theorist, archaeologist, and anthropologist at the same time. His work have been screened at art galleries all around the world, including Tate Modern, Sanders, Source Pompidou, Pacific Film Archive in Rotterdam, in Locarno, in London film festivals, among others. And he's a professor of film media at the Harrington School of Communication and University of Rhode Island. I think that we can say that for sure is one of the most important avant-garde filmmakers worldwide, with an iconoclastic film attitude and a certain style that works outside of Indian mainstream cinema. His films explore Indian philosophy with a unique existential signature, and at the same time, we can say that categorized by their use of avant-garde and pioneer cinematography editing. Here, we want to expand the discussion and create an atmosphere of philosophical and theoretical, and at the same time more experimental discussion about his work. And from this point of view, I would like to gradually to start with few questions about how did you start, and which was the main reason to get engaged with the cinema?
So, first of all, thank you very much for having me. This is indeed a pleasure, and I was really happy to read your essay on my film, Glossary on Non-Human Love, and this podcast, which emerges from that conversation, is something I'm really excited. And the questions you have sent me are also very engaging. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. To begin with, I come from the city of Calcutta, which is in the eastern part of India. Calcutta is also, if for your viewers, was the capital of the British India till 1911. And so it was a highly cosmopolitan, even when I grew up in 1970s and 80s and 90s, it was still a very, very cosmopolitan city with a very, very strong and robust film viewing culture. Also, this is the city that was the city of Satyajit Ray and Ritwik Ghatak and Mrinal Sen, some of the finest filmmakers of post-colonial India. And so I grew up in an atmosphere of hearing about them. And in my teenage years, I started watching films very seriously. There were independent cinema theaters. There was one independent cinema theater which would show a lot of films. So very early in life, at the age of 16, 17, started going to cinema theater to watch films. So I began as a cinephile who was interested in the world that was being shown, especially because I was in Calcutta. So to see films from France and Germany and not just from America, from Japan and other places was really an enlightening experience for me. The cinema was a gateway to the world for me in that sense. But then after my school, I went to Bombay. to do my undergraduate degree in social work, mostly because I wanted to work as a social activist. And during the early 90s, I was in Bombay from 1991 to 1990, which to 1991 to 1999, which, as you know, Bombay is the center of Bollywood. So there was another different kind of film culture. And that's when I realized, when I was in Bombay, that I started watching other kinds of film, especially because of the film festival circuits, that one could make films. It was one thing watching big films, the other thing to know that one can make films, make smaller films or short films. And around 1995, 94, 95, from Bombay, I went to a city called Pune. Pune is the city in Western India which has the only film school in India at that time, the Film and Television Institute of India. My initial idea was to see if I can get admission, but I did not get admission because that year they were not taking any students. So I ended up doing, I took a admission into the university and I did my MA in archaeology. One of the reasons I got into archaeology, although I was trained earlier as an undergraduate, my undergraduate degree is in social work, I moved to archaeology, mostly because archaeology was the only program where I could get in. And
Okay.
at that time, when I got into archaeology, I did not have a clue what archaeology was about, and I did not know that it will change my life. But once I got into archaeology, I got hooked to archaeology and ancient India and in ancient Indian history, that I never decided to go back to film school. I started learning filmmaking by hanging out with my friends at the Film and Television Institute. And then in 1995, I started making my first films. This was 16 millimeter filmmaking, which, as you know, was very expensive, especially in India. So one thing I realized very early, and this time I must be about 22 or 23 years old, that the kind of films I want to make does not have the film market. One, and secondly, there was nobody going to fund that kind of film. So I needed to do something on my own to make films. So since then, my basic idea of filmmaking is that I do my own work. Earlier, I used to write in newspapers. Then I went to the US to do my PhD. I saved money from my stipend, made my first feature film. And now for the last 15 years, I've been teaching in a university in US. I save money and make my own films. So that's my production logic. Fundamentally, because the kind of films, as you have seen some of them, there is no producer, because these kind of films don't make money. They are basically in the same way. For instance, there aren't philosophy books are not bestsellers, right? They don't make money. You need a different kind of logic. Most philosophers, as you know, are in universities or teaching somewhere, and they write books. And so I work in a similar way. I work in a university, except the big distinction between somebody who writes a philosophy text is that they do not need the money to write a book. But in my case, I need money to make films. So I try living simply, I try living spartanly, and then make my own films, which I have now been doing. Now in 2025 will be nearly 30 years of filmmaking practice.
Wow, excellent. And I have to admit that I want to ask you first of all about your first cinematic influences. If now, as you are looking in the past, do you think that was mainly films that are coming from the European or the Western cinematography, or it was something, a mix? We can say mix from Indian and at the same time Western filmography, or even from Japanese cinema, etc.
So I think what happened is that, India has a very strong filmmaking culture. We have one of the biggest filmmaking. So what happens is that when I was growing up as a child, I would watch a lot of films, commercial films, which was available and which would come in cinema, mostly because both my parents, during those years, we're talking about late 1970s and 1980s, the only means of entertainment was cinema. So, and both my parents were interested in popular cinema. They were not like cinephile watching art cinema, but they were interested in popular cinema. So every week or weekly, we would go to a cinema theater and watch films, mostly entertaining films. During those years, I think I was very young, so I don't have any idea of what filmmaking was. But then when I started going to watching films seriously, when I saw Europe, and that's when I saw European films, European filmmaker, that it really threw me apart, because commercial Indian cinema is very commercial. It's melodramatic. It's too popular entertainment. So when I saw European filmmakers, it really shifted my understanding of cinema. And here, I could tell you a few filmmakers I saw. For instance, in 1990, I was just about 18, 17 years old. I had a chance to see a retrospective of Krzysztof Kieślowski, which was shown at Calcutta. And that really, you know, at a 17-year-old person watching Krzysztof Kieślowski's, you know, a short story of killing, or Veronica, Double Life of Veronique, and things like that, or a Blind Chance. It was quite mind-blowing. It just totally changed my perspective of what cinema was. And around the same time, there were films, I got a chance to see films of Ingmar Bergman, Jean-Luc Godard, Louis Buñuel, because these films were coming and were shown in the cinephile clubs in Calcutta, and then later on in Bombay. In Bombay, I had a chance of seeing what I would consider one of my most, like most people and most filmmakers who do the kind of work, similar kind of work, is Andrei Tarkovsky. That he was, I saw when I was 19 years old, and in Bombay. And again, it was kind of it totally changed that cinema cannot. So through Kieślowski and Godard and Bergman, I saw that cinema can be about political storytelling. In the case of Tarkovsky, I learned that cinema can be about philosophy and poetry, and that changed my perspective. But when I went to Pune, I got a chance to see Indian practitioners who I think have had the most powerful influences in my filmmaking thinking, and that is two filmmakers, Mani Kaul and Kumar Shani, who are two of the most earliest avant-garde feature-length filmmakers in India. And I got a chance to see the film, and that totally changed my worldview, because both filmmakers like Kieślowski, Godard, Bergman, Tarkovsky, they were coming from a European perspective. So, and something that was alien to me, although I could understand something, but I could not understand everything. Also because the language of this film was completely outside. Russian, Polish, French, Swedish, they did not have an affective insertion into my consciousness. But then I watched films like Mani Kaul and Kumar Shani, and then also their teacher, Ritwik Ghatak, who's the Bengali filmmaker. Suddenly, I could see that there is a tradition in India to make really philosophical centric films, which was made in a language that I came from, Hindi and Bangla. And so that really had a very, very powerful impact in my filmmaking career. However, over the years, now if you ask me, when I went to the US, I got very influenced by philosophers. And for instance, I had a chance to study take classes with, take just few lectures with the great French philosopher René Girard, who was retired, but he would sometimes teach at Stanford. Then few other philosophers who taught at Stanford. I came to, during my time at Stanford, I studied carefully Heidegger and Deleuze, and those thinkers had a very powerful impact. So it's as I have grown older, my people who have inspired me have also changed. But to answer your fundamental question, I think the filmmakers who really have held my imagination, I would say, are filmmakers Mani Kaul, Kumar Shani, Ritwik Ghatak, Andrei Tarkovsky, Pasolini, Jancho, Miloš Jancho.
Great. Yeah,
These are the
you mentioned a lot, and I think that especially taking a chance from your reference to René Girard and his theory on the relationship of religion and sacrifice at the same time, or the whole rituality, probably it was something very important for you because I think this common thread about religiosity, rituals, and at the same time the position of individual is something very clear through all your films.
So what happened is that I come from a family of middle class family from Calcutta. So there are two things that is important in my biography there. That's the story of my parents. Both my parents are Punjabi, and their family, as in my grandparents, were affected by the partition of India. My father, who's now 84, even now it seems he is traumatized by what happened when he was 6 years old when partition happened. So this idea of being uprooted from your own land because of partition, and the crux of partition was religion, right, between Hindi and the tension between Hindu and Muslim, has been very much part of my upbringing. And then in 1992, I was in Bombay when the Babri Mosque in North India was broken down by Hindu fundamentalists. And that led to one of the large-scale rioting all across India. But one of the most ferocious riots happened in Bombay when I was there. So I saw violence very, very viscerally when I was 19 years old, 19 or 20 years old. And that has had a very deep impact in my life. And also as both my parents were also, I would not call them religious, but they also were they were deeply religious minded. So somewhere and then the city of Calcutta is also deeply religious, with all sorts of rituals and worship, public worship and ritual. That's very much part of the city's consciousness. So I grew up with religion all across, but initially I was in those years I was not sure what it meant, and I had a very difficult relationship because of partition, because of riots.
Mm-hmm.
But then it was after the Bombay riots of 1992, I really started thinking about religiosity very carefully. And then when I studied archaeology, that became almost an academic training, because in India, if you do archaeology, you also study ancient Indian history, which goes back to very early times. So religion is very central to the Indian civilizational consciousness. And since my early films, right from the first films I made, they were deeply driven by a certain understanding of philosophy and religion. And then that has now become the core understanding of my practice. Because I think religion in modern India has been misused. And I think it is very important to engage with it. And I think it is possible to create serious work of art, serious work of cinema by engaging through religiosity, through culture, through our own historical understanding. And that has been very central to my understanding. And then when I reached Stanford and had a chance to study with, I mean, I really did not study with Gerard, but he came and took a few lectures, and that really helped me to understand ritual and religiosity. Plus, there were other scholars. I was taking courses in Buddhism in Stanford. Stanford Department of Religion is very strong, has a very strong Buddhist component. So I took a few courses there, along with my own archaeology courses, which were all about a strong understanding of religion and anthropology. So somewhere ritual, religion, culture, became part of what I am, what my filmmaking practice was. But then my idea was never to make a documentary. I didn't want to make films that are just an exposition of religiosity. I wanted to think through it artistically rather than academically, or rather than, So I think of myself as a filmmaker who thinks through philosophy and religion. I am not a philosopher. I'm not trained as one, but my filmmaking framework is thinking through philosophical.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I completely agree, and I would like to share more with us about the whole procedure of how you put your archaeological and anthropological concerns inside the whole preparation of your cinematography. Because I have the feeling that at the end of the day, you can create a kind of, of a visual alchemy, and I think it will be very important for our audience to understand more how the whole preparation of your films started, were based, and how you succeed at the end of the day, this interdisciplinary combination between the whole fields of your education, at the same time your film love.
One thing that is also important is that really is seen in my film is that I spent my early adulthood as a political activist. So I was very much involved in the early 90s with a very important environmental movement in India called the Save the Narmada River movement, in which was a river, one of the most important rivers in India, one of the oldest rivers in India, also much older to the Himalayan rivers of Ganga and Yamuna and others. The river Narmada, and the Indian government was coming with a dam, which would displace about 500,000 people. And so I was very much closely involved with that movement. And most of the people who would be displaced were tribals, or the Indian word we use is Adivasi, original settlers. And that also has played a very important role in my cinematic imagination, which is a political understanding. So the way I started making films early in the 90s and in the early 2000s, they were all short films, mostly because I did not have enough money. If I sometimes think is that if digital filmmaking started in the 80s, I think I would be making feature films right away. But because it was so expensive to make on film. The way I think is that my filmmaking ethos is reading philosophy through filmmaking. And this is something I'm very interested in, is that I'm not a philosopher, but I read philosophy through filmmaking. And one of the processes I do, the way I go about, is that I read a lot. I spend a lot of time reading. That's a very important part of my daily life. And when I was as a graduate student and later on, I spent a lot of time reading Western philosophy, right? Starting from Kant and Hegel and Husserl, the phenomenologist, Heidegger, Deleuze, the whole gamut of Western philosopher. Eventually, my book is built upon the theoretical framework of Bruno Latour, who was one of the last of the Western philosopher. And so my philosophical reading has been very expansive in that sense, Western. And nowadays, for the last 10 years, I would say, I have moved away from Western philosophy and have been spending a lot of time reading Indian philosophy, which is a different kettle of fish, mostly because it's very complex and something I'm not trained in any senses. At least at Stanford, I had a chance to study with people who taught me how to read Heidegger, how to read Deleuze, how to read Bruno Latour. But Indian philosophy, I never had a chance. So I'm learning on my own, and which also means learning Sanskrit. I do not know Sanskrit. I mean, I do not know Sanskrit. I mean, I I can read it, but it's a lot of ancient Sanskrit is like pretty much like what's in ancient Greece is so different to contemporary.
Yeah,
In ancient Greek, it's so different to contemporary Greek. So it's a complicated process, and that's what I've been trying to deal for the last 10, 15 years. And it's a much slower process. So what I do in my filmmaking process is that I spend a lot of time thinking, reading, but when I'm making or what I'm making, I try to break away from what I'm thinking or reading. There has to be a certain degree of spontaneity to it. So, for example, if you're a philosopher or historian, you do what I call one-to-one epistemic shift, right? You read epistemology, a lot of books, and then you write an epistemic text, another book, right? But the kind of work in cinema, what I do is that I do a lot of epistemic reading, but when I'm making, I deliberately break away from it. And so I allow my own subconsciousness, my own spontaneity to arise. So one of the things that I do in my films is that I don't write scripts. None of the films that you see are scripted. The only thing I write are series of dialogues, which you see, let's say a film like Glossary of Non-Human Love. Since you've seen that, you've written about it, so I can tell you how I made that. I wrote about 30, 40 pages of dialogues, which is what you see in the film. But again, interestingly, I write in English, not in Bangla. Then I work with a very close friend of mine who's been working with me for the last 25 years. So he translates into Bengali. Language I'm very familiar, but he has a much more artistic understanding and literary understanding of Bengali, which I don't. And then I work with a group of actors. So you'll see some of these actors keep on repeating my films. I mean, I work with them not because they are great actors, which they are, but mostly because they are great friends and great collaborators. We think together, we talk together, and they work with me because, in a certain sense, they trust me. So I do not give them script. I said, okay, all you need to do, memorize these dialogues, and then let's go to a few places and we'll shoot. And the glossary we shot for about 35 days over the course of 1.5 years, where neither did I or the actors or the cameraman knew what I was doing, because I also was not sure. I just knew that we have a bunch of dialogues. And so the final film that you saw was constructed on the editing table, which is another process, right? For example, the idea of glossary itself happened after the film was shot. When I was making the film, I did not have any sense of the words or the glossary. So the words that you see and the images that are being juxtaposed was done during the editing process. So what I try to do in my filmmaking process is that I allow my unconsciousness, subconsciousness, spontaneity, whatever term you might want to use, in the act of the filmmaking process. So so chance and accident and different kinds of things attached to my filmmaking process. And at the end of it, and it is a long time. For example, a Glossary of Non-Human Love took close to about, I think, 5 to 6 years to make. And like, for example, the sound design took about a year, the editing took about a year. So it's a process, and you do it slowly. And I try to break away from what I have spent reading and thinking about, and just breaking away to let other things. It's not a very formulaic practice. There's a lot of
Of course. Yeah, of course. And did you expect this positive response globally to your filmography?
No, not at all.
Precisely because of all this complicated avant-garde and, of course, the unique traditional heritage approach of Indian culture. I think it's something very important. Tell me about that.
I think, no, I really appreciate you asking me that question. I think what has happened within the history of world cinema, and we're talking about art cinema, commercial cinema, is that what emerges from Europe becomes universal, right? So, for example, a filmmaker like Tarkovsky or Godard or any of the great European filmmaker, even let's say Theo Angelopoulos, for instance, from Greece, I think they are thinking very provincially. When I mean by provincial, they're thinking very deep in their own cultural framework, right? And that's the reason the films are so enriching, because they're very carefully thinking and making from a very specific cultural point of view. And then what happens with these films is that because they are, and this is my criticism, is that because they are from Europe, they have a global universal appeal, right? But the filmmakers from India, from the tradition I come, for example, people like Manikal and Kumar Shani and others, even Ritik Ghotok, is that they also think very carefully, very carefully, locally, culturally, philosophically, historically. However, because we are from India and we are at the edge of the global understanding, these filmmakers do not have a global appeal. And so this is a crisis, what we call, this is the crisis of colonial understanding, right? This is the problem of colonial understanding. And I think that still persists. But then sometimes when I have a response like the way you have responded to my film, few other people have responded, I feel very elated, because I think I am thinking very provincially, and it's a deliberate political process that I want to think through Indian philosophy. I want to think through Indian culture. And I hope, and this is my hope, is that although I'm thinking very locally, very vernacularly, very provincially from India, from Bengal, I think there has a chance of it having a certain global understanding or universal understanding. Also, I understand that I'm not making popular cinema, right? I'm not making even art cinema, I would think. I think I'm trying to think, as I said, I think the term I keep on using, I'm thinking through a certain philosophical process in my filmmaking. And they're not final say on any philosophical problem or thought. It's a process. It's not a thesis that I'm proposing in any of my film. It's a certain kind of a gestation, a certain kind of a thinking that you see, which I am kind of, let's say, making and leaving out in the world, mostly to spark questions, because questions are important than answers. And I think, and what I'm trying to do in my filmmaking, in my filmography, is to kind of really wrestles with certain questions that I'm dealing with, which I really don't have good answers about. So if you film like, I think Glossary of Non-Human Love is one such film that is really a very difficult film. I think, even within my own filmography, it is not an easy film. And so I was really surprised when I saw your essays, and I really enjoyed the way you engaged with it, because it's a film which is thinking through a certain idea, but it doesn't reach the final journey, because I don't really know where the final journey will end. And that's how I try to do in my filmmaking process. So yes, I'm elated that it has certain global ramification, but I realize that I am at the edge, or even outside the edge of the global universal ways of filmmaking.
Yeah, it's very important to connect these views with what you mentioned about the colonization issue, and at the same time, how much contributional was the whole beginning of decolonization debate generally for the cultural field. And what I'm feeling, and this was my inspiration for the essay on your film was that today, just because of decolonization, we have the opportunity mutually to focus on how each other interpret the uniqueness of human structure. And whatever we say and whatever we want to find as differences, at the end of the day, we have to exchange our languages about the human structure. So from this point of view, for example, I have in my mind your movie, correct me about my pronunciation, Apothkalin Trikalika. And this
English title is The Kali of Emergence.
Yeah, the blending of mythological and at the same time contemporary dimension is unique. Tell me about this film and the whole concept, your conceptualization for this film.
This film is actually also, I would think, a very complex film. Even for me to even explain how we go about. So the film is trying to think through the goddess Kali. Now, Kali is a very spectacularly important goddess in India, especially in Bengal, the eastern part of India. And for me, Kali is not merely a conceptual figure, but she's also, I'm a devotee in that sense.
Mm.
And I have grown up with Kali all my life, as in she's the city, she's also the goddess of the city of Calcutta.
Okay.
And she is a very ambivalent goddess at one level, in the sense that she is a very terrifying goddess, but yet she is the mother goddess. So this ambivalence is very central to her imagination. So Aput Kalin Trikalika, the Kali of Emergency, is my second film, which really directly deals with her. The first film is a film which is my second short film, which I made in 1999, a film called Kali Ghat Fete, which also deals with. And this was, so I made that in 1999, and I finished the Kali of Emergency in 2016. So it took about 15 years. Kali of Emergency tries to think through the idea of contemporary Indian political situation, where you have the rise of extreme Hindu fundamentalism, who are subverting the diversity of thinking in Indian subcontinent, right? Especially in India, not just the subcontinent, but in India. And I'm trying to respond to that in this film. Conceptually, the Kali of Emergency is built on the idea of three Kalis, which is, I don't want to get into too much of details, but the three Kalis emerges from a 10th century Indian tantric philosophical system called the Trika Kashmir Shaivism. It's a very specific, deeply philosophical, and also I think conceptually avant-garde within even the Indian thinking, which emerged around the 9th to the 11th century in North India and Kashmir. Which builds up upon a tradition of three goddesses, and they are emerging from Kali, and so I'm thinking through them. I mean, that's the conceptual basis of the film. Therefore, it is three Kalika, the three Kalis, and so the fundamental idea was that if these Kalis or these goddesses walk on earth, right? Walk on earth, engage with humans, then what happens? And that is, and in times of what I call emergencies. Now, emergencies in India has a very specific meaning, where in 1974 to 1977, the Prime Minister of India at that time, Indira Gandhi, had declared an emergency which basically meant cutting off all democratic and civil liberty rights. And it was almost a dictatorial regime for 3 years, where people were being arrested and killed. And it was a dictatorial moment in the democratic polity of India in the last 75, 80 years. And what I'm trying to suggest in the film is that we are living in moments of perpetual emergencies, which might not be expansive. It is not happening all over India, but that moment of emergencies are happening in different parts of India. Either it is in the tribal region where a dam is coming and police is coming and removing their houses, or it is happening in other regions in Kashmir, which has one of the highest number of army presence anywhere in the world, or in different parts of the country. So basically, we are in the state of perpetual emergencies in pockets in India, and I'm trying to think through that idea, and on the other hand, think through the idea of the three goddesses and try to merge it together. So it is more than mythology. It is philosophy and contemporary politics is merged together to open up certain questions. Again, it's opening up a certain questions rather than coming to a conclusion of any sort. And that is, and how I wrote it is again, it is at the and this is interesting, and there is a very interesting European connection to that film, is that some of the dialogues were inspired by this avant-garde British playwright called Martin Krim.
Yeah.
Who's I think so some of those, his writings, his plays an important role, and I work on those writings, and then we created the dialogical universe that we see. So
it's if I'm not wrong, also on Katho Upanishad, you have the same approach about a kind of meditation for life and death, and a certain translation of abstract philosophical ideas, and at the same time specific religious practical experiences. And do you believe that through these films, at the same time, the people that are participants come closer to your intention? To how do you feel that? I mean, the actors, the whole staff, if the whole crew come closer to your mentality through this.
I don't think so. My collaborators come to my mentality, but I think over the years they are empathetic to my directionless filmmaking. Let's put it this way. They listen to me with the trust, knowing that it will end up in a way which will not embarrass them. And so I now have collaborators with whom I've worked for nearly 20 years, 25 years. There's one of my collaborator who has acted in one of my films. Eventually we got married. And so there is a certain synergy to the people I work with. But I want to kind of respond to Kathopanishad. Kathopanishad is a very interesting film because it's a film which is based on a 6th century Sanskrit philosophical text, arguably one of the earliest philosophical texts of Indian civilization. And it's actually a non-dualist text, which is not a dualistic. It's a non-dualist text, which is something that also non-dualism in its theoretical framework has been a very important part of my thinking, which is one of the reasons I have moved away from Western philosophy, because I find at the height of at the brilliance of Western philosophy, even like when I'm reading Heidegger or Husserl or Merleau-Ponty or Deleuze, they reach a certain radical dualism. But I think I do not see them moving towards a non-duality, which is something I find in Indian philosophy. Now, Indian philosophy has a large spectrum. You have from complete orthodox dualism to what you can call radical non-dualism. There's a big spectrum. And Kathopanishad is a film which is one of the, where I'm really thinking, what does non-dualistic thinking can do to our contemporary existence? So if you look at Kathopanishad and you look at another film of mine, which was a shorter film made almost like around the same time as a film called Vakratun Swaha. It doesn't have a English translation, which is basically built upon a friend of mine had committed suicide. I had shot him just a year before he committed suicide. If you haven't seen the film, I can send a link to you.
Yeah, of course.
And it's not 22-minute film, which these two films they are kind of talking to each other, where there is a friend who has committed suicide. That's a film that took me nearly 12 years to make. It's a 22-minute film that took 12 years to make because it's deeply personal. And then at the same time, I finished that, and soon after I made Kathopanishad, which is about, again, a god of death trying to answer the question of a person who's asking how to get outside the cycle of life and death. So in a certain way, and so Kathopanishad is dualistic, non-dualistic thinking, and when I reach to Trikalika, it is also contemplating through non-dualistic ideas. So and there's a contradiction, right? How can you be non-dualistic in such a dualistic world? And in a certain sense, that is something that I keep on thinking even now in my films. And then you have the goddess Kali, who conceptually emerges around 8th century AD, and she is basically comes from one of the most. Her philosophy is what has been called radical non-dualism, which is very, very different to even the non-dualism that Upanishad is talking about. So I'm kind of thinking through all these ideas when I'm making my films, although not, as I said, I'm not making documentary. I'm not a propagandist. I'm trying to think through. I'm like, for me, filmmaking is a process of thinking through, and just, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I am sure that you know that for example, in the Western modern, how can I say, way of life, the Indian spirituality, translated, of course, according to the Western perceptions, is on the top. And many times people think that know very well ideas about yoga or tantra and everything about those important spiritual traditions, just because they have some practical and bodily practices. But this is, another thing, and has to do with, unfortunately, with this magical way of West to make everything an everyday banality. So tell me about your insistence on these long dialogues, on the narratives, on it's like you feel that more emotions could flow and blossom through this dialogue-centered approach on your film. And I don't know if you think at the same time that this is a kind of opportunity for the actors to be on the first line somehow.
Yeah, there's a film. This is very interesting. My third feature film is a film called Rati Chakravyuh, which is I think is my most audacious film. The audacity of the film is something that I sometimes surprise me, is that what we did is that we have a conversation between 13 actors in one single shot. And it's a film it's a film where 13 newlywed couples are sitting in a circle, and the camera goes round and round, and they talk for 1 hour and 42 minutes, and that is in single shot. That is something, as I said, it's a very audacious film. It's probably one of the first single shot film in India, from India. When I was making that film, this question is interesting, because when I was making film, I could see my actors. We rehearsed for nearly 6 weeks, and I could see my actors transforming, because it was almost like the dialogues I had written and my collaborator had written in Bangla they were getting possessed by it. Because it's not like a play. In a play or a theater, there's a lot of bodily action. You're moving from one end of the stage to another end. It was not like that. It is that you sit and you have to say your dialogue when your turn comes. Most of my actors who have been working with me for a few years, they say that, Ashish, when we are shooting your film, it is almost like a meditation. So they would, before they come and shoot for me, they would rehearse, sometimes mostly on their own. Sometimes they would we would rehearse together. But the best way that I have noticed that people who are able to take dialogue delivery in my film as a meditative act, they really are satisfied by their performance. And I give them that space. For instance, in a film, like I've just finished another film, which is going to be even longer, which is also a audacious film. It's like 7 actors talking, but they're in 7 different spaces. So they're not talking to each other. They're just talking, and there's 7 actors. It's nearly a 2.5 hour film of just talking. It's like for 2.5 hours, you'll just hear 7 actors talking as they walk in different landscapes. So we've shot in the Himalayas, we've shot in the ocean, we've shot in the forest. And there's 7 actors who actually never meet each other in the filmmaking process. So when we're shooting, they're doing monologues. And then when the editing, we have edited the way that they're talking to each other. And even in that kind of film, when we were shooting, the actors had to, when we shot the actors, I told them that you have to memorize 27 pages of dialogues or monologues. It's a 27-page monologue that we'll shoot in one take. And we'll shoot about 10, 15 times, and that's it over the course of a few days. And most of the actors have seen, they have transformed. They think, they tell me that that was one of the best experiences of acting. So yeah, I think I really pushed my actor and also the way my acting, as you've noticed in the film, is non-expressive. So the term that I use in most of my film is a term that I have coined. It's called infra-realist cinema, where what I say is that the way I explain it is that it comes, I think it's influenced by a filmmaker like Robert Bresson, to an extent. And then Bresson had a very strong impact on film like Manickal and Kumarshani. And then I have been very influenced by that, where the idea is that today's time, realist cinema, and especially social realism, is the only way to showcase cinema, right? And this is the kind of films you see in contemporary art circuits, Cannes or Venice or Berlin. They're all driven by a certain degree of social realism, where even the most bizarre thing has to be shown realistically. And I am really breaking away from that. So there are 2 ways of breaking. Either, so if realism is at, let's say, 0 degree, then you have melodrama, which is above 0 degree. Like you have melodramatic is completely bombastic. So I'm trying to move below realism, and you go really down. And so in the process, what happens is that I insist that my actors do not emote in this in any realistic manner. almost be disaffected, which my actors have said it has been often a challenging experience because most actors are trained to be affective, right? To show an emotion. And I tell them not to show emotion. So one of my actors told me is that, because you take emotions away from us, the only way we can act is to meditate. And that's how they act, or at least some of the actors who I work with act that way. But also, often I have
Fantastic.
been also.
That's a fantastic quote, that erasing emotions and what stays is just a meditation. Yeah.
And what is very interesting is that people who really do that well are non-actors.
Yeah.
Because and so some of these actors, when they work with me, they were non-actors. Now they do a little bit of acting. But I think one of the best performances that I find in my films are by actors who are actually non-actors, because it is much more natural for them to be non-emotive.
Do the viewers of your films share with you the same observations?
Oh no, no, not. The viewers, most of my viewers, see, I don't think of an audience when I make films. I'm not really concerned about that, but I do get a chance sometimes to listen to my audience or whoever. When I say my audience, and some people have watched my films. Often the audience, both in India and abroad, in America and Europe, they find such form of infra-realistic acting difficult and challenging. And there is a reason, because we are in the world of social media, constantly being bombarded by images, and these images have to be meaningful, right? They are supposed to. There is not a single moving image in the world which doesn't have meaning in today's time, either in feature film or entertainment film or social media, Instagram, Twitter. Everything has a meaning, and a definite meaning. It is supposed to tell you something. So, and everybody is consuming that constantly. So when they see my film, they assume that these will also give them meaning in the same way. When I mean by meaning is that everything is spoon-fed, right? You know what is going to happen, why you're watching this, either in the form of news or in the form of documentary or even in the 15-second TikTok videos and Instagram videos. You're spoon-fed what is happening, right? Therefore, when they see my film, it is very challenging for them, because I do not give them, or I do not spoon feed them. I do not explain things. The audience have to work hard to make meaning, which is surprising, because earlier it was, so for example, earlier a film by Godard or Bergman or Tarkovsky was about where the great films of films in which you were challenged to think, to make meaning for yourself. But that kind of filmmaking is now totally doesn't exist, even in the world of, big art cinema, like in festivals and things like that. Everything needs to have a direct, concerted, concrete meaning. Even abstract meaning is concretized.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
when they see my film, they feel challenged. So I have, about Letterbox, this online thing. So sometimes I read reviews by anonymous people who have written about my film. And so I see people hating my films and telling me that, yeah, basically, I feel the audience wants to be spoon-fed, but when they are challenged to think, I think they get irritated at times. Unless until you're trained, you have certain meditative quality yourself to think. And I think people who really enjoy my film are people who are able to allow for that non-thinking process, which in today's time is a rarity, I think. But but people watch my films, and yeah.
Yeah, but I can understand because it's very obvious your intervention on this relation of time and space, and you're trying to transformate the whole perception about time and space through your film, just because now that you are analyzed, is your approach to say that we have to concentrate on something that is beyond the rationality. And yeah, this is difficult for any kind of audience, for sure. Do you believe, Ashish, that this is the stable path if someone loves to make something avant-garde and experimental, to be constantly on and a kind of experimentation against the rationality in through the art means?
I think the term, frankly speaking, the term avant-garde and experimental have lost their meaning. I mean, what does it mean to be an experimental filmmaker in a form which is 130 years? I think all the experiments are done.
Mm.
Like it is 2025, cinema came in 1895. We are 130 years of a form. I think there is no way, there is nothing to experiment in cinema. I don't think of myself as an experimental filmmaker at all. I mean, neither do I think of myself as an avant-garde. I think, there is no avant to be guarded. There's nothing, everything is open. Everything is, there's nothing, there's the edge doesn't exist, so as to say. Neither does a possibility of any experiment. Therefore, so I'm not being pessimistic. I'm being very, very pragmatic. And by this, I mean that I think what is necessary for any filmmaker, and it is not just experimental or anything, I think it is important to think. I think what has happened in today's, we are actually, the first quarter of 21st century is over. The future is already beyond us, right? 2025 is something that is like 25 years of the 21st century is done and dusted with. And in this context, what has happened is that we are so obsessed with newness, new technology, new ways. Now, since the past year and a half, we have artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. A few years ago, we had iPhones, and then before that, it was computers and so on. So there's constantly new technology emerging. In the process, what has happened is that we have lost our ability to think because the newness takes over. And unfortunately, in the process, then what happens is that filmmakers, not just filmmakers, I would think filmmakers, artists, poets, writers, they're reinventing the wheel. It's old wine in new bottle, which I think is okay. Old wine in new bottles sell. It's good if you want to make a living. But if you have to do something different, for the lack of another word, because I don't want to use the term avant-garde or experiment. So let's say different. I think it is very important to going back to thinking. And for thinking, one of the important things of thinking is that if you have to think, you have to think in a context, because there have been thinkers before you. Thinking is, and we are, let's say, especially your culture from Greece and in India, we have been thinking for 3,000 years. And if we have to think now, we have to engage with that lineage of thinking, right? Very few people are doing that. I think even contemporary philosophers, for instance, if we think of them as the edge, as the finest, even they are not, I think, thinking enough. It is. So I think at this moment, for any filmmaker, whatever they want. I think it's important to kind of engage with a certain lineage of thought, and then intersect with one's own biography, or one's own, to use Heidegger, one's own being, right? To see where it takes you, because we are at a time that, as I'm telling about my films, there aren't good answers. I think what is important is to push for to question oneself. I think it is a certain kind of a self-reflexive way of being, and if it produces something good, it might not produce anything meaningful or useful, but the important thing is that do you want to do something? So either it is filmmaking or writing or anything. I think what I miss now the most among contemporary artists and contemporary writers or poets, authors, philosophers, that I find there is a certain plateau in their thinking, which I find a little. So I'm trying to. Probably it is happening with my own work also. I don't know, but I want to be. I want to constantly fight through that, and that should be the case with all artists of any kind, I would say.
Well, this is the best advice for any young artist and creator. And of course, as you understand, it's not so easy, to
Oh no.
to reaching this deep state of mind and thinking and even if I have the impression that you are trying to do something beyond thinking through your art, and your constant dialogue with the religion is like that. You need to find something more, that maybe you don't accept that art is only to use it for expression. Am I right?
I think you are, in the sense that, when I meant by thinking, this is something I feel. I was talking in terms in the context of young filmmakers or artists, because I think what you're taught in a film school is technology, and a little bit of art. What you're taught in an art school is a lot of technology and a little bit of art. I think what I'm trying to say is that our art schools and film schools and the world is so technology fetishized, is that we don't know why we want to. Why do you buy a new camera? Why do you want a new camera? What are you going to make? And I think that is what I meant. So my thing is that begin thinking. Once you start thinking, something will happen. And what I'm trying to do is that I have been thinking, and so what you see in my films is something which is beyond. Only after you thinking is the first stage, not technology. My point is that thinking is important, because I think it is easy to be a filmmaker today. You can buy an iPhone and you can start shooting, and you can make a film on iPhone. You can learn how to edit on YouTube in about half an hour. So I think technology is comparatively, let's say 40 years ago, in order to shoot on a camera, you needed to go to a film school because the film cameras were so expensive. So technology was expensive. Today, technology is really cheap and easily accessible. What is the crisis? The crisis is thinking. That was the crisis 40 years ago. That was the crisis 400 years ago. And I think that's the crisis even today. I think what is just because we are in 21st century, we have access to so much of technology, does not mean that we have evolved in our thinking. I think some of the most marvelous cutting edge thinkers were there more than 2000 years ago. I think that is what I meant. It's that we have to, the young people or anybody, any artist, you have to start with the thinking, then decide what you want to do with the technology you have at your disposal.
Yeah, super. If it's the challenge of our century.
Indeed.
So if we want to discuss about your plans to do new things or to prepare uh, your future projects, do you work like that, or do you follow mostly your instinct about what do you prepare and how you are make the whole laboratory starting? Have you something that you say today that I want to do in the next 5 years or in the next 4 years? I have the impression that you are not this type of the creator.
I think your impression is right. No, I am not. I really don't have a idea for the future, in the sense that what I'm going to do in the next 5 years. Although I'm making a bunch of films. I'm in the process of making a few films. They're at different stages. Some of them I'm editing, a few I'm shooting. The films that I'm shooting, I really don't know what I'm doing. I mean, if you ask me what is the story of this film you're shooting, I will not be able to tell you genuinely. I have actors with whom I work because they are empathetic to the way I think. They also don't question me. They just listen to me, and they do their work, knowing that something will happen. And I also feel that some kind of work will emerge. So, but right now I'm very at the moment I'm really at a stage where I'm really thinking about a certain idea of to put it in a very broad spectrum, is that about consciousness, and which is what I was talking about to you earlier about the difference between dualism and non-dualism, and what does it mean. I think it's a journey that I think I've reached a certain understanding. I don't know how it will reflect in my filmic work, but I'm really interested in what does it mean to be cognizant of our own being. And the answers, I do not find it so, let's say, compelling in the Western philosophical system. And I have been surprised that I am finding some very, very interesting answers written about 1200 years old, 1200 years ago in India. So I'm spending a lot of time reading and thinking about those things. And I think they will eventually come in some filmic form, but I am not sure how. At the moment, I think of myself, I'm in my early 50s. If you ask me what you think about future, I just want to be healthy enough to keep on thinking and making films. That is my only future plan. So I try to not to overeat. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, this is the most important. But I will stay a little more on your problematization for consciousness and non-dualism. Now I have in my mind a few thinkers that came from the Western canon and tried, maybe not with success, to approach this. For example, I have the first case is Friedrich Nietzsche, and highly inspired from the Indian spirituality in his age, or few thinkers even that came from the European idealism, even Fichte. Some aspects of selling and not exactly the Kant, but we can say also the same about the mysticism of Christianity, even if, of course, the influences that came from Middle East had a certain impact. So the thing is that, this is the important contribution, according to my opinion, of Indian civilization, that your tradition and heritage successfully always keeping open this door about non-duality. On the contrary, in the West, even these few examples and cases were just sporadic efforts. And maybe from this point of view, I think that it's important to tell me more about this concern about the consciousness from your non-dualistic approach. I mean that if you are thinking that it's something that has a certain universalist and Catholic dimension, because of course it's not something that restricted on a civilization. It's something that has to do with the broader meaning of spirit, of being, for everybody all around this planet. So I mean that it's not only a kind of provincial or ethnological uniqueness, for sure.
No, I absolutely, I agree with that point. So I think one problem I have with the Western thinking is that they make a distinction between mysticism and philosophy, right? Yeah. Mysticism becomes religious, but philosophy is agnostic, right? And I think that is, for me, that has been a problem. Although, for example, some of the all the Western philosophers were Christian, right? But if you read Kant or any of these, Kant or Hegel, or I think the only philosopher that I think is able to merge mysticism, religiosity, and philosophy is Schopenhauer. I think he's the only philosopher who's doing that. Whereas the other philosophers make a clear distinction that mystical thinking is nothing to do with philosophy, that's very religious. But I think that doesn't happen in India. And here, I mean, that doesn't happen in India. I am talking not just about what we call Hinduism, but that is something you also see in Buddhism. Also Jainism, the three religiosities that still exist from ancient times, is that the Indian philosophical system and all these three religions, and even when Islam enters India, especially, because in Islam also there's a distinction between Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy, and you do not see a combination. I think when it reaches, I think, and this is a broad generalization, but I think when it reaches India, especially the kind of Sufi practices that you see in India, the Indian Sufi tradition attempts to merge mysticism and philosophy. Because in India, there is a tradition. There is no distinction between mystical practices and philosophical thinking. It is part of the same thing. And that I think is very important. Distinction between the Western framework and the Indian framework. And I would say that is also very, this split between mysticism and philosophy also seen in China. They also don't make that distinction. Or in Japan, for example, is another example. In Eastern thought, you do not see a distinction between mystical experiences, which is a very ontological practice, and the philosophical writing, which is an epistemic practice. You do not see the distinction, which something you see in the Western framework. Now, the idea of consciousness that I'm kind of thinking about comes from the Indian system. And when I mean by Indian system, I'm not talking about Hinduism. It is, you see that very deeply in Buddhism. You see that in Jainism. So when I mean by Indian system, it is the combination. Is the relationship between body and consciousness. That through certain bodily practices, one can achieve a certain uh, cognizance of consciousness. Now, how they do it will require
Yeah.
another podcast, for instance. But fundamentally, what we see in India, and I think this is quite a important thing, is that around with a text, with a film, with Kathopanishad, I think is a very, very important moment, 6th century before Christ, is that there are a group of people, and these are Hindus and Buddhists and Jains and other sectarian identities in India, who make a very interesting relationship between the external world and the internal consciousness. And they argue that it is that the external world cannot exist without consciousness. And I think they make a very important statement, is that, and this is something, if you read contemporary neurosciences, neuroscientific research in the last 50 years, there seems to be a very similar kind of understanding emerging, that consciousness, as in the energy that keeps us alive and conscious of our system, our world, is probably more important than the physical world that exists outside. And there is a thinking of, this is something you see in certain neuroscientific conversation in neurosciences, where the center of research is the brain and what is happening inside the brain. And I think what is happening in India is that around 6th century, within Indian thinkers of different sectarian viewpoints, there is that understanding, probably not that scientifically articulated, but a certain understanding is emerging, which I think you see a fragment or a glimpse in Kathopanishad. You know, when I think of Kathopanishad, I think of it, it's actually a manual of a camera that is lost, right?
Yeah.
We don't know what the actual practice was. We have very little understanding of what that practice was or could have been. All we have is a manual which says that this is the practice. Whereas in Buddhism also, what we see is, interestingly, I think more in Buddhism, we do have a sense of what those bodily practices are and what it could do, especially in the context of Tibetan Buddhism. I think we have very clear evidence of a direct lineage of practice and thinking for nearly about 1500 years. Unbroken, and that is important, unbroken. In the context of Hinduism and Jainism, we also have unbroken practices, but because of the way, because of the historical currents in India, they have been either corrupted or adulterated, or there are certain gaps, and which we do not see, especially in the Tibetan context, mostly because they were isolated from the rest of the world. And so you have a very, very interesting continuity there. And if you read contemporary researches on Tibetan Buddhism and consciousness, we have some really astonishing understanding and of bodily practices and thinking and mind. And so that's one. The other thing that I have been recently, over the last few years, been very, very, it's opening up a new world, but I think is psychedelics, especially used within the Amazonian rainforest, in Mexican and in Native Indian. And we are talking about psychedelics like ayahuasca, like the mushrooms and cactus and these others, which is another very, very powerful understanding of consciousness, very different to the Indian, and the very different to Indian. But I think there's a very interesting correlationship between these two very different kind of worldview, using different kinds of processes, but both of them seem to be. So I'm especially very interested in what is called ayahuasca, which has the active ingredient is this molecule called the dimethyltryptamine. And I think there's a very strong relationship between what's happening in Amazonian rainforest, probably as early as 3,000-4,000 years old, earlier, to what was happening in India about 2,000-3,000 years. And I think there's some interesting correlationship, which there are some scholars who are trying to map it. And so it's this kind of thinking about consciousness.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you find archaeological and anthropological explanations for this successful permanence of non-dualism inside the Indian religiosity?
I think there's very little archaeological evidence, because I think because archaeology is all about material culture, right?
Of course, yeah.
Also within anthropology, we have very little evidence, because anthropology seems to be thinking about only the past 200-300 years. But we do have certain understanding through the texts. What is very interesting is that this understanding of non-dualism and is emerging in the last 30-40 years, mostly because, I would say in the last 25 years, mostly because new kinds of texts, which were earlier hidden, in the sense they were part of the royal libraries, or they were part of certain religious order, are now being preserved. They are being scanned and translated. And it's a new form of knowledge construction that is emerging. For instance, there are some texts in India, in tantric texts, which have made public, which has a public life after 1,000 years in the last, because of what has happened in Nepal. They were part of the Nepal royal archives. Till it was part of the royal kingdom, those archives was closed, and it was not accessible to anyone. But after the Marxist revolution, so as to say, which brought down the royalty in Nepal, those archives were opened up to public and to scholars, and new texts which were largely hidden from public view for more than 1,000 years have come out. And scholars are translating that. So we have a new thinking, a new understanding, for instance. And that is something also happening among Tibetan scholarship. Some Buddhist texts which were never accessible to public are now being translated and published. In the process, a new understanding, let's say a new epistemological understanding of consciousness, both non-dualism and dualism, is emerging, which is really, I feel lucky to be here, because just imagine, for the first time in 1,000 years, you're at a time when the book gets opened up, right? And a new understanding comes, which I think is a very interesting time in India. So I think, yeah, I wouldn't say it is so much archaeological and
yes,
historical.
my interest is related with the educational and at the same time the contribution of the people's tradition, of how the Cebu people without even knowing have this impersonal power to keep something, to continue something through the ages and through the centuries. So this is something what we call intangible heritage.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that is there that exists in India, more so in other parts of the world, because of historical reasons. Although I think a lot has been erased, a lot have been lost forever. But I think there are certain fragments that still exist. And if you think of my whole body of filmic work, it is a way of engaging with those fragments.
Yeah.
I think, and this is the archaeological way of thinking, is that through small pot shard, you imagine the whole pot. And I think that is what I'm trying to do, is that we have certain fragments of philosophical text, and through that philosophy, one is trying to imagine what the whole practice would have looked like.
Yeah. Well, I think that we are reaching the end, and I would like, first of all, to thank you because this discussion for me, it was like a brief spiritual guide, and at the same time, I'm sure that will help all of us to understand that if we want to contribute to heritage, we have to understand that many other civilizations have things to contribute and to correct us. So thanks again, Ashish. Really a real honor, and I am sure that we will update what we can do together for the arts and heritage of this global importance through your work. I wish you the best, and of course, I wish you to stay unpredictable and without any plan until the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation, and also I really hope that this kind of exchange between us continues, because I think this is also a very important way of having a South-South conversation, which often doesn't happen. And I think there's so much to learn from Greece, and from you're the cradle of European civilization. So I'm really happy to have this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. My honor.
Om Aing Ring Sing Sarvan Matin Nay Nama. Om Aing Ring Sing Om Nama Sarvan Matin Nay Nama. Om Aing Ring Sing Sarvan Matin Nay Nama.